In the previous lesson, what we did was talk about taking an introduction to the way in which the structure of government existed within the Ancien regime, which was the regime that existed in pre-revolutionary France. Now, in this lesson and the next few lessons, what we're going to do is start to talk about the problems within the Ancien regime that start to give us an indication of how this system would devolve into the revolution that begins to take place towards the end of the 1700s. And we're going to begin by talking about the society within the Ancien regime, the way in which the class system operated within pre-revolutionary France, and the way in which the burden on the society in terms of, for example, the tax burden was essentially distributed across these different classes within a society, and how this can lead to a certain sense of class consciousness within the French Revolution, and therefore lead to a certain sense of resentment towards other parts of the class. So we're going to explore essentially the structure and society of the regime under the structure of society under the Ancien regime. And this is important for our study of the French Revolution, since it gives us insight into how the societal divisions and inequality existed within the French state. And for the most part, and the most common way in which we understand the system in which society was split in pre-revolutionary France, we see that it is split into three estates. Now, the first estate was the clergy, and the clergy made up less than 0.5% of the French population. It was a very, very small part of the overall population of France, but it owned a great amount of property, and the majority of this property was obviously due to the influence of the church, because we're talking about the clergy. So, despite the fact that the clergy only made up 0.5%, around 0.5% of the French population, they actually, as a result of the church, owned around 10% of land in France. So we have quite a sizable disparity in terms of population to ownership. Now, more than just the ownership of land, the clergy also had significant control over a number of areas of society, again due to the influence of the church. So they had a lot of influence over education, over hospitals and healthcare, and also over a system of poor relief that existed within the state as well. And so we can see that through the use of the church, and through the influence that they have on land ownership, as well as the influence that they have on specific areas within society, the clergy had quite a lot of influence. The second estate was the nobility. Now, the nobility, again, made up less than 1% of the population of France, so slightly larger than the clergy, but not much larger than the clergy in all eventualities. They made up a total of around 120,000 people. But this is where we see the greatest amount of disparity in terms of wealth and ownership, because despite the fact they made up only 1% of the population of France, and despite the fact that they were around 120,000 people within the Second Estate at this time, they would own between 25 and 33% of all the land in France. So 1% of the population, and between a quarter and a third of the entire population, the entire land that is owned within France. And within the Second Estate specifically, the nobility, we can actually split them up into two main kinds. And this is on the basis of their relationship with the king and within the central tenets of government, and the relationship that the king has in terms of establishing new noble families and new noble households. So we have the nobles de corps, who were the nobles that were located at Versailles. Again, incredibly wealthy individuals. The nobles de corps would comprise with the king's advisors. They would make up the king's ministers, the king's ambassadors, and therefore have a significant amount of political influence, because they made up the sort of core, the core government membership that the king would rely on for his decisions when it comes to different policies and different political processes. So that's, as a result of that, the noblesse de corps were very, very influential, both through their wealth and the fact that they owned so much land, but also through their relationship with and proximity to the king. Within the second state and the second kind of noble, we have the noblesse des robes, and these were members of the nobility that were created by the monarch himself. So the way in which this worked was the monarch would sell legal and administrative officers with hereditary title. And so therefore, while not having the same kind of influence within the inner parts of the government structure, they were still incredibly influential within the second estate because, again, of the amount of wealth that they owned and the amount of land that they owned as well. So we also have, on top of these two broad main categories of the second estate, there are also less wealthy members of the nobility as well. These would live in the countryside and they would be dependent on feudal rights. And the feudal rights and the relationship that we have with the system of feudalism that still existed to an extent at this point brings us to the third estate. Now, the third estate was the largest part of French society, and we can essentially suggest that the third estate was everybody else who lived in France. It was roughly the size of that of about 28 million people. So compared that to the 0.5% of the population within the first estate, the clergy, the 1%, the 120,000-ish people within the second estate, the nobility, now we have around 20 million people, 28 million people that make up the third estate. Those who lived in towns were considered to be the bourgeois of the third estate. So it wasn't like this 28 million people were a completely homogenous group within society. There were people who had more status and more wealth within the third estate, and there were some people who had a lot less. So you had sort of bourgeois parts of the third estate within society, and then you have the majority of which lived within peasantry, who lived as almost proletarian peasantry, and they would be existing in the countryside. 80% of the French population in the Ancien regime lived in the countryside, and they would survive under systems of subsistence farming. So this gives us some indication of how society is structured. We have a lot of wealth being distributed very heavily towards the top of society. You have a lot of the vast majority of all the wealth being owned either by the second estate, the nobility, or by the first estate, the clergy and the church, or by the very top of the third estate. Sorry, they're sort of seeking a way to get into that second estate. Now, due to the fact that the church would make an annual grant of around 16 million livres to members to the French state in terms of an annual grant given to the French government, members of the clergy were exempt from paying tax as a result of this. So the very top of the population that owned around 10% of land would be exempt from paying tax. Now, while this is a lot of money to pay, in reality, it looks like a lot of money to pay, it only represented around 5% of the total church's income. So even though the church was giving up quite a lot of money, seemingly quite a lot of money when paying tax annually, in reality, they were only giving up 5% of their total church income, and as a result of that, every single member of the clergy, the entire First Estate, were exempt from paying any kind of tax. The heaviest tax within society was known as a land tax, or a talil, and this tax that the nobility was exempt from paying as well. And while the nobility would pay some taxes on the basis of certain kinds of income, a lot of the tax that they were expected to pay could be avoided. So we see a situation here where we have the wealthiest within the society of pre-revolutionary France being very small in terms of the number of population and being incredibly wealthy in terms of the amount of land that they own and the amount of influence that they have in relation to the king. But in reality, the amount of tax that they pay, the amount that they actually contribute to the French state itself is very low. And it's actually a lot less compared to that of the heavy tax burden that was paid by the peasantry. For the most part, the majority of the tax and the tax burden was paid by the peasantry. So rent would be paid to a peasant's seigneur. Now, a seigneur is just the French word for a feudal lord or a lord of a manor, essentially their landlord. And this would be a phrase that we would use within pre-revolutionary France. And they would also have to pay taxation on grain harvest as well. In addition to both of these things, the third estate could also be subject to conscription, something that the nobility was exempt from. So when it comes to international conflicts and armed conflicts abroad, the nobility were exempt from any kind of conscription into military forces. This is not the case for the 28 million within the third estate. So we can see already that on the basis of the estate system that we have, and on the basis of the tax burden that is placed on each of the different parts of the estate, that there is a very heavy tax burden that is has to be paid by the peasantry in both rents to their seigneur and as well as grain harvests as well. The nobility were exempt from certain tax and certain other burdens like conscription, and the clergy were also exempt from certain taxes as a result of an annual grant paid by the church. But we can see here that this is a very unfair, unequal kind of society where 28 million people who are the poorest within the society have to pay the most of the tax, whereas the majority, where all the wealth is, the very small minority, where all the wealth is at the top of the society, pay very, very little in comparison to the wealth that they actually accumulate. In the next lesson, what we're going to do is talk about how we can explore Enlightenment ideas and how we can look at the Enlightenment philosophy behind things such as liberty and freedom and the influence of things like the American Revolution on the French society that would ultimately lead into the French Revolution.